Wow. I love the impartation that God has on your life for others. And it's, I just feel, you did not take away from my time. Don't ever think that. But thank you for sharing your life with us, really, even some intimate parts. I think that is just so special because there's just, there's something about you, not just what you do. And thank you. There's a you that comes through in what you do. And I think that as you've been on your journey, God has unpacked that. And he has parachuted you in so many things. And it's just unbelievable to really hear that story, because it's not every day for every person. And I'm really hoping to bring that out of who Esther was. I don't really need to do an introductory. I just can dive in. Because Esther, we all know the story of Esther. She was a remarkable woman in this book. But she didn't start off that way. I just want to kind of give a background of Esther. She was an orphan. She was a Jew. And she was in captivity. They came out. In that process, it indicates potentially that that's where her parents died. But she was brought up by a family member, Mordecai. And that was her cousin. And she had a lot of respect for her cousin. He was a leader in that time of captivity. But there's just, when you look at the story, when you read the story, there was a genuine relationship that they had. She was very obedient to Mordecai. And one of the biggest things that come out in this book is that she was beautiful to look at. And maybe that was something when she was growing up, maybe that's all I've got, is my beauty. Being an orphan, being a Jew, she was in Persia, okay? And if you guys don't know much about history, there is so much history in this book. I've been learning as I've processed with Chris on this book. I mean, he's the historian guru in our family. He knows everything. But there is so much history. And Esther wasn't just this nice story. There is intense history in here. The king at that time, Xerxes, or there's other names, he was a man of great power. And the book starts off that way. And he was having a 180-day party, okay, because of how long he was reigning. He only reigned as king for a few years, but he was having this big celebration. And, drinking and, festival and all of that. But his queen at the time disobeyed him. And what was his instant reaction? Get out. You no longer will be queen. That's a big deal. It's not like just leave the room. It's I don't want to see you again. That intense rage of who King Xerxes wasn't just in that moment. He was crazy. He was a crazy king. There was a point where he got his army to build a bridge, and there was a storm, and the bridge destroyed before the army could use that bridge to get where they were going to go and conquer. He was so angry, he ordered his armies to take their whips and whip the river into submission. Okay, this guy was crazy. And that's not just, I heard this preacher go off about all these other incidents in the histories of this king, and I was thinking, man, this guy was crazy. And King Esther, okay, she was ordered, she had no choice, to go and prepare herself for a whole year to think about coming before this king. Not just to come before the king, but to become his wife. And this man was not an easy temperament. And so you could imagine, in that preparation, what would be going through her mind. I think she would have had an indication of this man, especially because she was under his wrath at some point as a family, as a people. And so she entered this contest, and we all know she won. She won the favor of the king. And, before that contest, her identity was this Jew, and she was this orphan and didn't have much going for her. But now she has this new identity as queen. And she obviously was taught, the rules and the regulations. I mean, being a queen wasn't just this glorious thing. You get to sit with a beautiful crown. There was, times when you weren't with the king, and you had also some laws that went with that you couldn't just enter the court. And so she knew these things. And so there would be such a great insecurity that would have come with, okay, I knew who I was, but now I'm the queen. Okay, and so she was deemed the fairest of them all. She had a favor. She won in tremendous favor with this king. It says in Esther 2, the king loved Esther more than all the women. Now you got to remember, there was a lot of women. Okay, there was 127 provinces, and you just do the math. There's a lot of women, okay? And she carried charm and favor before him, more than all the other virgins. So he placed a royal crown on her head and made her queen in replace of the other queen, Vashti. So in this time, there was a bit of a backdrop going on, okay? So Mordecai was at the gate. He was most likely a guard, but he was also very much in a watch. Okay, what's going on with Esther? He was probably asking different people, have you heard about this girl Esther, And so then when she became queen, he was even more attentive. And of course, as a father, he's been directing her and giving her guidance and all of this. Now that's being ripped from him. He's not able to, continue to raise her, really, or continue to impart. And so you have this, he's sitting there and he's waiting. And then there's this other man, Haman. You guys remember him? And he had power, and he really liked his power. You go read in the scriptures. He was very arrogant. He was very, I am the best. Even when, he gets more involved and close to Esther, he boasts about how Esther loved him above everyone else. He would go and tell his wife and his other fellows. He was a very, arrogant man, and he used his power, and he made, a decree that everyone should bow to him. Well, Mordecai did not bow to him. We all know this story, right? He did not bow, and so he went out in rage, and he wanted to destroy the Jews, not just Mordecai, but all the Jews. His hatred was huge. And so there's this backdrop of this going on. And Esther is completely oblivious to this. She doesn't know what's happening. And so Mordecai refuses, and this infuriates Haman. And so he brings to the king, and he says, let's do this. Let's destroy the Jews. And the king agrees to issue and to all the provinces to scout out all the Jews and to destroy them. So, of course, Mordecai, what does he do? I have to tell Esther. Esther can go to the king, okay? So what we're doing is we're going to start in chapter 4. And in that beginning there is where Mordecai learns the king's orders of the Jews to be destroyed. And the Jews instantly go into fasting and praying, and they wear sackcloths and ashes. And of course, Mordecai gets onto that, and he's at the gates, at the king's gates, and he's doing this. And Esther hears about this, and of course, she actually has no idea what's going on. So she's sending clothes to him, again. What are you doing? Just, put on these other clothes. And he's no. And so what he does is he's like rejects these clothes, and he sends a message. And he says, explain to her, this is in verse 8 of chapter 4, and explain to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. Now, one thing you've got to understand is Esther, in the great confusion of going into becoming a queen, Mordecai said to her, "Don't tell anyone that you are who you are." Don't tell anybody. She had to hide her true identity. And so now he is starting to slowly direct her to do this. But in that great panic, he is saying to do this. Now, the thing that I really have on my heart is to really draw out this dialogue between the two of them. Now, of course, this is actually, there's middle people, there's eunuchs, there's all these people that are passing back these messages, but they've been able to just get those quotations, which is really good. But the thing that I really have on my heart is that Esther knew in this time of her life how to align her identity. And she did two things. And I hope we can really draw this out and just really hear from God in this. But the one thing that she did was what she drew on and what she helped align herself was going back to that relationship with Mordecai. Okay? She continued to dialogue with him on this. So he's sending this message, and he's saying, explain to her what's going on, and tell her she has to go and plead with the king to do something. Esther was in a hard place. Okay? She knew the rage, and she knew this king, and she was in a new place of her identity. This identity of being a queen was thrust upon her. And there's lots, I couldn't imagine how much insecurity was going on for this young girl. She was young, okay? And the message she puts back to Mordecai was, all the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds a golden scepter so that they may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come to the king these 30 days. It's a long time. We can often lose our identity. We can lose our way without understanding who we are. I'm just going to get a drink here. Can you hear me pouring here? We can lose our way without identity, okay? And understanding how that shapes our destiny. And this was what was going on with Esther. She was losing sight of that. She was losing sight of who she was. But it wasn't for long. Esther focused on focus was on what she hadn't been called. Sorry, I've got this written weirdly. But the thing that she had to do was to see the call that was on her life at that time. And she had to run a risk, and that was death. And she knew that. And she was focusing on, what is it going to do for me? I'm going to die. And there was this focus on self, at that brief moment. And so Mordecai didn't waste time as a good father. He didn't waste time, and he replied to her. And keep in mind that he knew her well. He did. He knew her well. He raised her. And you can see how what a good parent-child relationship they had with just the dialogue that is going on here. But he didn't want to waste time, and he knew that deep down inside, Esther is a very obedient and loving girl. And he says, "Do not think to yourself that the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you kept silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Incredible timing of his words. And I always wonder how long was he brewing on that? Because he would often tell her, don't say anything, don't say anything, don't say anything. But here's your identity, and remember it. And, Esther had a choice in this matter. She's listening to these words. They're not coming directly from Mordecai. They're coming from a messenger. So she had a few moments where she could just ponder what Esther was saying. What Mordecai was saying to her. What was her choice? What was Mordecai saying? He was saying, you could keep silent. And temporarily, you will be saved. But also, one thing I love about Mordecai is he knew his God. There's no talk about God directly in this book, but that right there, that he knew that the deliverance for the Jews is going to come from somewhere else. Because they knew the Messiah was coming at some point. And he was being truthful with her, and she had a choice to be silent. She didn't have to directly tell him right away. She had time to respond, but she could keep silent, or she could trust. She could trust. Now, trust with this situation especially, when we're trusting, we don't determine the outcome, especially when we go with God. We, in whatever we do, doesn't determine our outcome. He does. He determines that outcome. And so we need to run into what God has called. And she needed to run into what God had called her to be a part of in that season. And it was scary. And her fight wasn't in what her position was. That wasn't the fight that she was dealing with. She was thrust into this new identity, but she knew who she was. And the fight for her was coming into agreement with God in who he says she is. And that was really important for her. She had to align and agree through this relationship with Mordecai that what he was saying was actually not just from him, but it was from God. And when we find what that thing is, whatever it is, for Esther, it was going before the king, but for others, whatever it finds, it's something that we want to give our lives to. We want to commit to, right? We want to go wholehearted, especially when it's done with God. And so we want to come into her, she had to make that choice. And the second thing that she did to align her identity was one area that she did that was her understanding of God, okay, and her people. And it's in the next verse after that, her response, that's where you're seeing this. And she says, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days." That's hard. If anyone's ever tried that, that's definitely difficult, okay? Night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. This is a famous thing that we look at with Queen Esther. But, she in that response was saying, I know my God, and I know what I need to do. I need to call everyone to fast and pray for me because I am scared. I need the wisdom of God. And she was, so she fasted and she prayed. And, when we want to have impact, it does demand a level of risk, okay, at times. And her risk was to perish. And she had one more moment, so she probably hung on to those 3 days thinking, I potentially only have 3 more days of my life. fasting and praying in that intensity, it inspires me. Because it wasn't just this, okay, let's just focus on prayer. And no, she was doing it for her life, but she was also doing it for the life of her people and the life of the Messiah. She may not have comprehended that all in that moment, but that's really what she was doing. And she understood that. I believe she understood that. And because her response, okay, so she aligned herself and her identity through relationship, a key relationship in her life, and then with God through fasting and prayer, and called others into that. What was the result in walking in her identity and drawing from that relationship and drawing from God? The thing that brought her was courage, okay? Because what happened was, as soon as the fast had ended, she immediately put on her royal robe and walked into the inner court. It just, that's what the scripture says, and so I'm going with it. And that is courage. It's standing up in the midst of all odds. But she had that 3 days of intensity with Jesus, or God, Father, okay? And Jesus hadn't come yet, so, so that was her courage. And when she walked into that court, there was an immediate favor. She constantly had incredible favor with this king. It was like he was a different man when she walked into that room. And she immediately had that favor from him. And then through that time of praying and fasting and grabbing onto her identity and who she was and knew what was going on, the wisdom came. Mordecai told her, go to the king and request that the Jews get released. But she didn't just do that. It was thoughtful. If you haven't read the story or it's not fresh in your mind, the wisdom, she didn't go directly, okay? And she held a feast, greatest, to a man's heart. Food, drink, okay? She was wise. Seriously, all the guys are like, yes, okay? That's not manipulative. She was using wisdom. How do I do this without, what am I doing? And she invited Haman along, okay? Get him into a little corner, I think. But she was very, very discerning. And the thing that I love about watching Esther in this moment was she didn't have Mordecai anymore. Mordecai, you know what he did when she said, go and do this, fast and pray? He immediately obeyed her command. And that's the last you hear of Mordecai for a little while. He wasn't there directing her anymore. She rose to a new level. She was with God and the king. And she rose to this new level, and she no longer was under the direct direction from Mordecai, but from God. And she held the feast, and then there was a little thing that went on with Mordecai and got some favor from the king. Mordecai got honored by the king. There's a little side story there. And then there was another feast, and that is when she disclosed Haman's plan. And he immediately, rose up and was angry. And he actually left the room because he was so angry. And then he came back in and, saw that the way he was conducting himself was very dishonoring to his queen, and that rose even more anger, and he killed Haman, okay? And long story short, okay, and he was gone. But what happened was quite remarkable. Now, Esther was given the position, okay, of what Haman was carrying. And then she disclosed who Mordecai was. And, and then he was called into the court, and then Esther actually gave him the position that Haman had, which was like a prime minister almost. I don't know. It was under the king. And, that to me, and then Esther continued to be a woman of influence as long as, this king lasted. There's lots of stories with this king. Go do the history. It's an amazing story after this, but in the history books. But I love this story because God's outcome came to pass. And the Jews were saved, and the line of Christ continued through this line. And Esther grew into new depths of identity and impact. And when I look at her story, and I think, not every one of us are going to have kingship type experiences. Not all of us are going to, have moments where, like in Esther. But I believe that God does give us those moments every day. And it may not be with a king. And, you look at different testimonies and all of those things, but the thing that I really, really want to draw for us is looking at Esther in this particular way, is looking at what are the key relationships that we need to draw from in our lives that is going to strengthen our identity. I listened to your story, and I'm thinking there's so many people that have come in your path that have you describe it as pushing your faith, but it's coming alongside and mirroring what God wants to do in our lives. Who are those key people that will champion you, that know you well? And, or are there relationships that you're doing that with that aren't the ones that God has, that aren't actually helping you get to a deeper and a new level of identity? Who is telling you who you are? Is it the voices behind from when you grew up? Who are those voices? Or are there people in your lives that aren't really esteeming you into that true identity of who God is in you? And where do we need wisdom and courage in our calling? And how does that relate to who you are? These are questions that, you've got to ask yourself when you look at an Esther. And she was remarkable. She knew who she was, even in the midst of a little bit of an identity crisis. She knew who she was, and she defaulted definitely back to that. And it was a remarkable point in history as well. And so I just really encourage you guys to take those key. And I mean, Robbie might have some more that he feels like to connect in, but just to really think of those is those key relationships and how they affect our identity. And where do we need that wisdom and courage from? So.
Thanks, Debbie.